Hello, and welcome to another edition of Topics Worthy of Discussion. This is part two of Tempo. In part two, we're going to build on the ideas from part one. I highly suggest you watch that first, and it can be found in my Topics Worthy of Discussion playlist on YouTube. Here we'll be expanding on our previous definition of tempo, which was the beats you have played affecting creatures on the board relative to beats played by your opponent. To recap, you can count tempo in terms of beats. If you play more beats than your opponent, you'll build a tempo lead. There's a couple of issues though with this definition that we'll fix here. First, not all beats are created equal. Let's compare two cards. The first is the Luminous Broodmoth. I would definitely call this a bomb rare. It's a 3/4 flyer for 4 mana that can reanimate creatures and give them flying. Pretty cool. Let's compare that to another 4 mana card, the Gale Swooper. The Swooper is pretty decent as a 3/2 flyer and can give another creature flying for 1 turn, but is it as good as the Broodmoth? Not really. So I think we can safely say that some beats are stronger than others. So now we can modify our definition to say, the beats you have played affecting creatures on the board relative to beats played by your opponent, some beats are stronger than others. What this means for building tempo is that the better your cards are, the more tempo they will create. Okay, let's move on to the next issue, and that is that timing matters. As the game goes by, cards that may have been good beats in the early game will grow weaker with each turn. Take the Alpine Watchdog, for example. If you play this on turn 2, it's a pretty decent play, and definitely a relevant creature at that point in the game. However, if you play this on turn 10, it's likely to be a much weaker card, and make less of a difference in the game. So as time goes by, this card is going to go down in value. So let's modify our definition again. This time, we'll say some beats are stronger than others, and also weak beats go down in value as turns go by. This has a couple of important implications for tempo. Firstly, early tempo disappears as the game goes on. As the game goes on, more powerful and expensive cards make earlier beats less relevant. The power of a card can even things out or even give the upper hand to a player that was behind in tempo. Also, if you find yourself coming out with some early tempo, finding ways to cash that in and push damage should be a priority. Even if you can't win the game outright, dealing damage early can completely change how the rest of the game is played. And some cards are strong beats at any point. Cards that are good at any point in the game are usually great picks in draft. They give you the flexibility to tempo your opponent if given the opportunity. You're more likely to survive someone tempoing you and perform well in the late game if it comes to that. Here's some examples. Behind door number 1, we have the Gnarlid Colony. You can cast this in the early game for 2 mana and get a 2/2 creature out of it. But if you have this in hand later in the game, you can also pay the kicker cost to get a 4/4 creature instead. This card scales with the game, which makes it a good play at any point. Behind door number 2, we have Pacifism. This card can disable most creatures effectively. It's cheap enough that you can disable an early threat if you need to, or you can save it for disabling a late game bomb. It's a good beat at any point, which makes it a high pick. Behind door number 3, we have Bontu's Monument. This card will reduce the cost of all of your black creatures and can also drain your opponent's life total. It's a decent card if you play it early, but if you play it late, it's not particularly useful because you won't have many creatures left to cast. This card isn't great at all points in the game, which makes it a lower pick in draft. Okay, there's one more issue with our definition we need to clean up, and that is that context matters. In other words, the board state, each player's life total, or even the amount of cards in hand can all dictate how strong a particular play or beat may be. For example, suppose all that's on the board is your 1/1 squid token and your opponent's 4/4 angel token. You're at 4 life and your opponent is at 20. You cast the only card in your hand, which is the Ether Tunnel. This makes your creature a 2/1 instead of a 1/1, but does that make a difference in this game? Probably not. So we're going to insert the word significantly into our definition. Alright, so that's our final definition. The beats you have played significantly affecting creatures on the board relative to beats played by your opponent. Some beats are stronger than others, and weak beats go down in value as turns go by. Note the changes we made here are going to make it harder to reliably count beats and award tempo to either player. So do we get into fractional beats maybe, or adjust each beat as turns go by? Of course not. Beats are still a useful tool for analyzing tempo, but it's a little subjective and not an exact science. Okay, let's get into another interesting topic, bounce spells. A bounce spell is a card that can return a permanent of some kind to its owner's hand. Bounce spells can have many uses, but since we're talking tempo here, let's just consider them as tools for bouncing your opponent's creatures. Bounce spells are often referred to as tempo cards, and by our definition, we would have to agree. They can remove a creature from the board, and therefore they will give you beats and affect tempo. However, this gain may only be temporary. When your opponent replays the creature you bounced, the beat they gain will balance out the beat you got from bouncing it. If this is true, in most cases bounce spells will only maintain tempo and not change it. So if you're ahead in tempo, playing a bounce spell can help you preserve that advantage. But if you're behind in tempo, playing a bounce spell may only preserve your opponent's advantage. So bounce spells can help if you're ahead, but if you're behind, they may only help your opponent. Let's look at an example. Suppose your opponent has 3 creatures in play and is about to attack. You have no creatures on the board, are down to 10 life, and have totally lost in hand. You think to yourself, this sucks. I can bounce one of his creatures, but that will slow him down for a turn and that's it. In this case, playing totally lost will give you a beat for removing a creature from the board, but your opponent will replay his creature instantly. If we assume that all you can do is bounce a creature, and all your opponent can do is replay that creature, your bounce spell will mostly just preserve the board state for one turn. It will save you a bit of life, okay, but you'll be in just as much trouble when the next turn comes around. So the bounce spell preserves your opponent's tempo and doesn't help you very much. Now suppose you're on offense. Now you're the one with 3 walking corpses and your opponent is at 10 life. The difference is your opponent has one 3/3 blocker in play and you're the one holding totally lost. Given the board, now you're the one with tempo. You can now bounce his 3/3 and your 2/2s can get in safely for damage. True, he'll replay the 3/3 the following turn to regain that beat, but in this case totally lost is more helpful. It's still only maintaining tempo, but this time you don't mind that at all because it's in your favor. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and sometimes bounce spells can permanently affect tempo. Suppose, for example, your opponent uses Giant Growth, and in response you bounce their creature. This will cause Giant Growth to fizzle. If it was going to kill one of your creatures, you will have denied your opponent a beat, which permanently affects tempo. Also, playing cheap bounce spells can allow you to do multiple things on the same turn. This will make the temporary gain from bouncing more significant because you'll be further ahead when the creature is replayed. Some bounce spells do more than just bounce, which can lock in tempo as well. The Mana War is a creature, so it actually gives 2 beats when you play it, one for bringing a creature into play, and the other for bouncing something. This is a bounce spell that does permanently affect tempo. And the more things you bounce, the longer it will take your opponent to replay them. Sea God Scorn can bounce 3 creatures. If your opponent can't replay them all right away, your temporary advantage will last longer, and it's more likely to impact the game. So I think bounce spells can be useful, but when it comes to tempo, removal is just better. I mean, removal also takes creatures off the board and gives you a beat, but it does so permanently. You add to your tempo instead of just maintaining it. Maybe they should call removal spells tempo cards instead. That being said, if you can't find enough good removal while drafting, bounce spells can help fill that gap and give you some tools that may help with your tempo. Virtual tempo. Another interesting aspect of tempo is virtual tempo. It can be defined as temporary tempo that can be easily lost. Some cards can give an extra spike in tempo, but that tempo will be lost if your opponent has an answer or if a certain amount of turns go by. This can be useful offensively or defensively. Let's do some examples. Suppose both you and your opponent have a walking corpse in play. You cast the Chillbringer. When the Chillbringer comes into play, you can tap down an opposing creature and that creature won't untap for 2 turns. In this case, your opponent's creature is rendered useless for the time being. You gain an extra beat for disabling their creature. In a couple of turns that creature will untap and you'll lose the extra beat, but you're going to cash in that extra beat for damage, so this works out well for you. Now suppose you're on defense. Your opponent has 2 walking corpses in play and is beating you down. You're down to 5 life, and you play a Those Who Serve, a plain old 2/4 creature. You get +1 beat for playing a creature, but is that all? No, it is not. Not only did you play a creature, but now your opponent has no profitable attack. You also get +2 virtual beats for disabling 2 creatures. If something changes or your creature gets removed, those virtual beats will evaporate, but otherwise this is a great play for you. This illustrates another key point about virtual tempo, in that it's subjective. The board state will dictate how you count for tempo in the early game. If one player is clearly on offense and the other on defense, we should count tempo in terms of cards that help the offensive player get in and cards that help the defensive player protect himself. In this example, if the player casting Those Who Serve had actually been the one beating down the other player, we wouldn't add virtual tempo for rendering the walking corpses bad attackers. In that case, the player with the corpses probably wouldn't be interested in attacking, is more concerned only with surviving, and can still double block the Those Who Serve profitably. There's other ways to gain virtual tempo. Arlen's Wolf restricts what creatures can block it. Turning good blocks for your opponent into bad ones is a good way to gain some virtual tempo. Also, the Kargan War Leader can pump up other warriors you have in play. This can also turn good blocks for your opponent into bad ones, or bad blocks for you into good ones. And the Fairgrounds Warden can exile a creature as long as it's in play. So it gives you 2 beats, one for playing a creature and one for killing a creature. But if it dies, your opponent will get their creature back, and the virtual tempo will be lost. Alright, that's it for part 2. In part 3, we'll face 2 decks off against each other and put it all together. Thanks for watching.